Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this session. And I want to thank the Mises Institute for inviting me and the donors for making it possible. So I was asked to talk about the political economy of policing, and first I think I should explain what that is. So, what it is. So the political economy part, basically by that I mean the economic analysis of the institutions through which policing is provided. So this is going to be a comparative institutional analysis, mainly between what normies think of when they think of policing, right? This is your state law enforcement agents, but I do include that, but not only them, but also anything, non-state as well that is done with the purpose of protecting persons or enforcing property rights. So I'm taking a pretty broad view of what I mean by policing as such. The primary part, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, or maybe that's an overstatement, but the light by which I see everything else is through economic calculation. So police departments, state-provided police, they are bureaucracies, and the defining feature of bureaucracies is that they are unable to engage in economic calculation. So thinking about the Dr. Salerno's lecture about economic calculation under socialism, right? The issue here, right? Even if you have markets for final goods, so we have prices for outputs. I have a little dollar sign there. The main problem, as you recall, is that you don't have market prices for inputs, right? If the state or the people or the central planning board has control of all productive resources, there's no private property in them. Therefore, there's no exchange and no market prices that develop for them in terms of money. And so, right, the central planner is in the dark, like, oh, we don't know whether we're allocating resources to more highly valued uses. And I think of bureaucracy as somewhat of the inverse of this issue, where bureaucracy is operating in an otherwise market economy, that they do have meaningful market prices for many of the inputs they acquire. Right? Government bureaucracies have to go into markets to acquire goods, and those have meaningful market price. So they do have a measure of their accounting costs in terms of this meaningful cardinal unit. But they don't have a price for their outputs. That's why I have a question mark there, if you can see that in the back. So think about a police department. They don't have a measure of marginal revenue. They are mainly taxpayer funded. Now you call up the police, maybe they come and do something. Maybe it's valuable, maybe not. But regardless, there's not a market price for it. So likewise, we don't know, as a police bureaucracy, whether we are allocating resources to more highly valued uses. I want to say a little bit more about the prices of inputs. So many of the inputs that police departments purchase, guns and cars and handcuffs, these have civilian uses. Most of them, anyway, or maybe they all do. So these have meaningful market prices. They have to bid them away from other uses. For certain types of inputs like labor, this can get a little bit fuzzier, a little bit more nuanced. So certain kinds of labor that's used in the public sector has a pretty close voluntary sector counterpart. So if we think of something like janitorial, custodian services, it's pretty much the same whether you're cleaning a government building or a private business. And so the price that governments pay for that is going to, probably fairly accurately reflect its opportunity cost as valued by entrepreneurs operating in the voluntary sector. The more specific these inputs are to government outputs. So when we're talking about police officers, some of the things they do may probably demanded by private markets, but there's not as close of a private sector counterpart like there is for say, a bookkeeper or a custodian. And so in this way, we have less of a good idea of how much a police officer should be paid. And I put should in scare quotes because I don't mean like how much do they deserve. It's more in terms of what's their marginal revenue product? What do they contribute to the value of the output produced by the bureaucracy? But again, the bureaucracy doesn't have any marginal revenue product because they don't have any marginal revenue. Their revenue comes from taxation, not consumers voluntarily demonstrating that they prefer the output of the bureaucracy compared to the alternative uses of their money. And so this point will come relevant later in the lecture when I talk about police unions. And because we don't know how much they should be paid in terms of the discounted marginal revenue product, there's more room for chicanery and fudging in terms of whether they're overpaid, but we can't objectively say they're overpaid because there's no real market for them. So this, I like this graph. I use this a lot. It's widely applicable. You can kind of put whatever you want, label these curves however you want. But what I'm trying to communicate here, if we think of the x-axis as you move along it, you're buying more policing, which hopefully reduces the amount of crime or other bad things happening. The problem for the bureaucracy is that, I mean, while this cost of crime prevention, right, might be defined for them as they buy more inputs, they can engage in meaningful cost accounting in terms of market prices for inputs, as I just mentioned. This downward sloping curve, you could also describe, instead of the cost of crime, the benefits of crime abatement. This is not defined. There is some point beyond which expending more resources to reduce crime is not worth it. Consumers would rather allocate resources otherwise. There's some level of crime people would be willing to tolerate. And yeah, let's spend our money elsewhere. But yeah, to reiterate, the big problem for bureaucracies is that they don't know. So that can be an issue of, yeah, let's have more resources to reduce crime more, but if the goal is to allocate resources to their most highly valued uses, the bureaucracy is in the dark in determining where this optimal point is. So this is the big epistemological issue, I'd say, in policing, that police bureaucracies can't engage in profit and loss calculation. So what do they do instead? I'd say the main ways in which they try to evaluate their performance is based on data they collect incidentally. Things like reported crime, arrests, or clearance rates. Clearance rates being mainly, if there's a reported crime, was it cleared by an arrest? Though there are other ways in which, like if the suspect dies or something, these are ways in which the FBI considers crimes to be cleared. But, I mean, you can see these aren't really any substitute for profit and loss calculation, right? I mean, thinking about reported crime, I mean, I guess when crime goes down, police officers would like to take credit, like, yes, we're doing a good job. If it goes up, if they say, yeah, it's our fault, but it's an argument for why we need more resources to bring crime down, right? So it's like, is this a good measure of police performance? Probably, there's a lot of issues. Is more arrests better? I mean, this is, an output, but arrests are expensive, right? It's not always, the best use of resources to make an arrest whenever a crime occurs. So, of course, there are, issues with this in terms of using them as a proxy for police performance. I would say the best social scientific research in terms of attempting to deal with this question, because it was Eleanor Ostrom and her colleagues at the Indiana University, where they, the question they were considering at the time, what was popular, maybe it still is, in terms of municipal governance was consolidation, where why do we have all these suburbs, independent municipalities have their own police departments? Why don't we have one big one so we don't duplicate services? So they were attempting to shed some light on this question in Indianapolis. They looked at similar townships, those that were getting served by the police department, or the Indianapolis Police Department, those that had their own independent neighborhood police departments. They surveyed, as valuable as surveys are, they surveyed residents there. How do they feel about the policing services they received? And how much did these police departments spend per person? And so while you can tell some things from this, like if people liked it better and it was cheaper, then you say, okay, maybe this is a more efficient scale at which to organize municipal policing. But if they liked it better, but it was more expensive, then it's ambiguous. It's not very much not a substitute for actual markets in terms of consumers being able to express what level of service they want and how much they're willing to pay for it. So even though I consider that probably some of the best, it's still very limited in how well it can evaluate the quality of policing. By contrast, when we're talking about the voluntary sector, when there's competitive markets, these institutions that allow for economic calculation, private property, competition, money prices, economic calculation is possible. We can talk about this at the individual level in terms of psychic profit. If your home is your castle, and say you want to invest in certain security devices, you build a moat around your castle, you fill it with alligators, you put in a drawbridge. All of these things have market prices. So you can say, here's how much it costs to build my moat, and here's the psychic benefit at a subjective level. I prefer the services I receive from these security devices compared to alternative uses of my money. So you can do that at an individual level. You can also do it commercially. That is, if you are running a business and you either purchase security from a specialized firm or provide it in-house, you have money prices for those costs of whatever security device or personnel you're purchasing, and then you can compare it to a benefit that's measured in monetary terms. Might be additional revenue from having greater security losses prevented, or higher capital values. And so you can meaningfully, and I'm not saying this can do this perfectly, I'll give some illustrations, but you can tell whether these investments are worth doing. So one illustration of this, taking this from Fox Business, this screenshot we have over in Philadelphia, there was a gas station having problems with patrons being held at gunpoint and robbed while they're pumping gas, which isn't good for business. So the gas station hires this guy. He's got a rifle. He's in an attempt to make people feel safer, that they won't be held up at gunpoint while they're pumping gas. And so the gas station owner, acting as an entrepreneur, he can measure the costs of hiring this guy, having him around, cost of ammo, or if you have to discharge weapons and all these other costs associated with it, and then can compare, okay, what was revenue like before we hired this guy versus afterwards, and determine, was this guy worth hiring? Is the revenue generated by his presence greater than what it costs to bid his labor away from other uses? And so here, economic calculation for this security is possible. In addition to whether economic calculation is possible, there's other institutional differences between policing provided by bureaucracies and policing provided in the voluntary sector that I think are important and relevant. So one is that government policing primarily takes place in the public domain, or public property, if you prefer, that those areas which nominally everybody owns or nobody owns, but they're not privately traded, so there's no capital value to them. To the government streets and sidewalks, these other areas to which everybody's supposed to have access. Another difference that I think is quite important is that government police are constrained in terms of the rules they can enforce and how they can enforce them. Excuse me. So an issue with bureaucracies is that they don't face the same constraints as private actors, right? If they're taxpayer funded. So lest they become tyrannical, you want to constrain them in some way. But this has costs of its own, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So now, I guess I want to emphasize this issue of that there's all these kinds of trade-offs. I mean, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is a list that I'll want to talk about today, where there's competing values and without the institutions that allow consumers to express their preferences and what they're willing to pay for, policing provided by bureaucracies will be in the dark. And so the implication is that if you find problems with being, say, in this convenience and dignity and security trade-off, having more of one comes at the cost of the other, and bureaucracies will be in the dark in finding that optimal trade-off according to what consumers want. So I'll talk about each of these. So first one I just mentioned, convenience and dignity and security, trade-offs between constitutional constraints and security, and whether to use force and how much force to use when you decide, it's time to take the gloves off. Various enforcement policies, and then getting into some issues with police unions about their wages and working conditions and the trade-offs associated with those. So regarding this convenience and dignity and security, one example, maybe you've had experience with them, perhaps on your way here, is with the Transportation Security Administration, where they now give scalp massages and ASMR. And I don't know what this. I haven't experienced this myself. I don't know what security function this serves, but it must be crucial. So the problem here is when you have a monopoly in the provision of airline security, right? I mean, they want to, presumably secure airplanes, but is there any, how do they navigate this trade-off, right? It's probably easier being in charge of this bureaucracy to err on the side of, say, security or even security theater. Who cares about convenience or your dignity? Say, if this were instead a more incentive-aligned arrangement, I would think, is, say, if the airlines themselves were in charge of securing their own airplanes, right? On the one hand, they would want to make things as convenient as possible. Presumably, flyers would prefer that, all else held constant, to avoid the head massage and taking off the shoes and all of that business, unless these were security measures that, because they have hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of capital goods at stake, right? So they do want to protect those. So they want to find this optimal trade-off between convenience and security as evaluated by consumers. And if you have the institutions of competition and voluntary trades that allow consumers to choose where they'd like to be along this trade-off, then to use that Hayekian phrase, this competition becomes this discovery procedure by which entrepreneurs are able to determine where along this trade-off that consumers want to be. Another example of this, probably can talk about all kinds of examples. I like this one. It's in a Kroger, this grocery store over in Georgia. So in this picture, it is displaying within this Kroger an additional barrier walls around certain items that seem to be more prone to theft. So there's one entry and one exit, and hopefully in the attempt to prevent shrinkage, or as they use the term, losses. And it says some customers upset over changes at a Kroger, like saying, I feel like I'm being treated like a criminal at this Kroger. I don't like it. There's a cost to this. So the manager of Kroger, this Kroger, making an entrepreneurial decision, has to determine whether this is worth doing. So again, it's not going to be, I mean, economic calculation doesn't allow for omniscience. They won't know, okay, precisely how many consumers decided, okay, I'm going to go to a different grocery store because I just find this indignity unacceptable. But they can have a rough idea, like what was revenue like before we had this barrier? What's it like afterwards? How much less shrinkage are we experiencing? And we can measure these things in dollar terms. So again, they can determine whether this is worth doing. And also, again, there's this constraint. They don't want to be so onerous that, more people decide to leave and they lose more revenue than the dollar value of losses they prevent. Very similar example, this is in Baltimore. You go to certain neighborhoods, there's everything you buy is going to be behind some bullet-resistant device. But again, here, pretty much the same issue, right? There's this trade-off between convenience and security, and entrepreneurs are going to want to find where that optimal trade-off is as evaluated by consumers, and it's only through competition that they're able to do this. So moving on to this issue of constitutional restrictions. So Mises, in his great book Bureaucracy, and after this lecture, go buy a copy. It's only about 100 pages. It's everyone should read. It's a wonderful book. He states in here, if one assigns to the authorities the power to imprison or even to kill people, one must restrict and clearly circumscribe this power. The law determines under what conditions the judge should have the right and the duty to sentence and the policeman to fire his gun. So for Mises, since bureaucracies aren't constrained by profit and loss, they have to be constrained in other ways. And so the main way is like having all these rules that they have to follow. Follow the rules. And hopefully things work out well because they don't have these same constraints. But this has costs of its own. I like how Randy Barnett, the legal scholar in his book, The Structure of Liberty, describes this, what he calls the dilemma of vulnerability. And this is related to the point about government policing primarily taking place in the public domain, in which he states that a society that includes extensive public property holdings is faced with what might be called a dilemma of vulnerability. Since governments enjoy privileges denied their citizens and are subject to few of the economic constraints of private institutions, their citizens are forever vulnerable to governmental tyranny. So that's why you have these constitutional restrictions on what police can do to you, right? At least they're not supposed to, and at least in the American case, like come arrest you because they just think you're up to no good. They don't like the cut of your jib or however the phrase goes. They have to have probable cause that you have committed a crime or reasonable suspicion that you're about to commit a crime in order to detain you. So this is to restrict them lest they become a governmental tyranny. But the dilemma of vulnerability is the more that the government police are constrained, now your vulnerability moves to private criminals that are more open to engage in chicanery because the government police are restrained. So that's the trade-off. This is the dilemma of vulnerability. They're becoming more vulnerable to government police or private criminals. So how to navigate this trade-off? So regarding this issue of order maintenance, either in the public domain or on private property, as I mentioned, government police are constrained in their ability to maintain order in the public domain. In the public domain, basically, if you are, unless you're, say, on probation and parole and restricted from certain areas, you have access, the same access as everyone else, where this is not the case on private property. Private property owners are able to exclude people that, if they don't like the cut of your jib or think you're up to no good, they don't have to provide a reason, right? So laws against certain disorderly activities, these things that, in certain areas, like where I am near Asheville, North Carolina, you do see a lot of these activities in the public domain. A lot of vagrancy and loitering and panhandling and public intoxication. But various courts, in considering enforcement of these rules, have voided them for vagueness, right? If things like a police officer sees this woman waving, is she soliciting for prostitution, or is she trying to hail a cab? You know, it's ambiguous, right? And so that is one reason why these laws, like, we don't want this governmental tyranny, but does that allow for disorderly conduct in the public domain? So an illustration of kind of an alternative to this that I find interesting are these guys. So these are, I love their uniforms. These are the Beatles of Burlington Arcade. The Burlington Arcade is this upscale shopping area in London. And these guys are considered one of the oldest private security services that still exists. So they provide security for this area. And they enforce certain rules that would be considered unconstitutional if an American police officer were to enforce them. So a couple examples of this are, within the Burlington Arcade, whistling is prohibited because at some point in time, this was a code used among pickpockets to communicate with one another. So like, okay, no whistling to prevent pickpocketing. Another prohibition is against making clucking noises because ladies of the night in the apartments above the shops, they'd advertise their services by making these clucking noises, I guess. So, cluck, cluck. So this advertised to men who shop and like, hey, we're available. Of course, this might not be good if you want to keeping up appearances in your upscale shopping area. So you can't make clucking noises. Of course, prohibiting whistling or making clucking noises as a municipal code in the United States, that would be illegal. So the real constraint here, instead of constitutional constraints on First Amendment purposes, et cetera, instead what constrains private property owners is competition, right? They don't want to have rules that are so onerous. If people really want to make clucking noises, right, an entrepreneur will want to serve that end. So it's competition that restricts heavy-handed rule enforcement on private property. Somewhat related issues. This question, whether to use force or how much force to use. So depicted here, this is again in Philadelphia. This is at a Philadelphia Starbucks a few years ago. There are two individuals being arrested in this picture. So what happened was they said they were there to make a real estate deal, and they were waiting. And I think one of them asked to use the restroom, and they were told, well, you either buy something or leave. And I guess they did neither. And so the manager of the Starbucks called the police to get them to leave, and but this kind of went viral. This created a bad publicity for Starbucks. And they're like, man, look at this. And create a bunch of fallout. I guess several thousand Starbucks locations were closed for a day or half day of training to prevent this from happening again. The Starbucks CEO met with these individuals. I think he might have created a scholarship for young entrepreneurs in their name. So this was very costly for Starbucks, that they made an entrepreneurial error in their use of force. Even though it was government agents acting on their behalf, still operating in this context where profit and loss calculation is possible, they're able to determine that, yes, this was an entrepreneurial error, that they should have tolerated this nuisance rather than, and to be clear, they are in their rights to enforce this, but it might not be the profit maximizing decision. But they're able to tell because they are in an environment in which profit and loss calculation is possible. And what I really like about this particular story is that economic calculation can tell you when you're overcorrecting. So a few years later, I see this headline: Starbucks to close 5 Seattle stores over safety concerns. That is, they overcorrected. They became too tolerant of certain nuisances, of, say, certain individuals shooting up drugs in the bathrooms and these kinds of things that made employees and customers feel unsafe. And so they ended up closing these stores. So, again, Economic calculation allowed them to tell, here, we're either being too heavy-handed with our enforcement, or we're not being heavy-handed enough. Also, the lack of economic calculation leads to an inability to determine what's optimal policy. So one example of this is whether to engage in hot pursuit, where some police departments really restrict this, right? And you can understand why. I mean, the benefits of limiting hot pursuit, right? They reduce the liability of police officers, because, when they chase, they might get into car accidents. The person being chased might get into car accidents. This isn't good for public safety. So the idea is, if we don't chase under certain circumstances, we're going to reduce the likelihood of a car crash. Along with this, that if we don't chase them, then they're not going to drive recklessly. Of course, this comes at a cost, right? There are certain individuals who know, if I'm not going to be chased, then maybe I will be more likely to break traffic laws. Or, I guess along with that, I borrowed this phrase, deaths of exuberance, from Steve Saylor. During the Summer of Love, he observed that a lot more traffic deaths happen. It seems like after one of these big incidents involving an officer-involved death, that police officers around the country tend to withdraw a bit. I don't want to end up on the news. And so they engaged in less traffic enforcement. That his argument is that, this led to these, this is the inverse of deaths of despair, right? Deaths of exuberance, we're going to have fun, we're going to drive, maybe drinking and driving and having some fun. And this leads to deaths of exuberance. There's also fewer entertaining police chase videos. That's another cost, when there are fewer police chases. So how do we know what the optimal policy decision is? Sounds grammatically funny, but we can't know. Not when we have road socialism. That's the main issue here, is that when economic calculation isn't applied to roads, then we don't know the optimal enforcement rules. I want to talk about police unions a bit. Very interesting phenomenon. So, especially after 2020, it seems like when I was getting more calls from media outlets, because I was writing about police unions and things they're up to. And one of the things that police unions get for their members, as unions do, is not only, I guess you could consider this part of better wages and working conditions. One of these working conditions being job security. That is, if you have rules that make it harder to punish police officers for misconduct, this increases their job security. This is a substitute for higher wages. That is, all else held constant, greater job security means you can pay lower wages. It's similar to college professors and the institution of tenure. And if you had two similar colleges, similar positions, if one offers professors tenure and one doesn't, one seems more attractive. So the one that doesn't is going to have to offer higher wages to compensate for that lesser job security. And interesting enough, we have pretty clear illustrations of this in Chicago. So around a decade ago, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Chicago Police Union, they negotiated, in lieu of pay increases, since the city was on harder fiscal times, okay, instead of pay increases, give us greater job protections. And the city's negotiators decided to do that. And then, a few years later, there was problems with misconduct. The city created a police accountability task force. I believe Lori Lightfoot was on this task force. And they had a number of recommendations. And one of the recommendations, part of the reason why you have this misconduct problem is because of these job protections that make it harder to punish police officers. And so we recommend getting rid of those, that this will improve or reduce the amount of police misconduct. And the Fraternal Order of Police president said, yes, we'd be willing to do that, but bring the checkbook. It's like, pay us more, and yes, we will negotiate fewer job protections. So I'd say this is a pretty clear illustration that these are substitutes, wages and job security. And I mean, also part of this trade-off is, well, if you give police officers more protections, that might mean lower taxes, at least in the short run. Yeah, that'd be interesting. Somebody should do accounting of whether the payouts that the city has to pay when they get sued from this misconduct, whether, yeah, should have just paid more wages beforehand. Because they have, as you imagine, it seems to be, yeah, truly, I mean, people talk about, oh, it's just a few bad apples, but there are the bad apples who are responsible for the big judgments against the city. Another thing I think would be interesting, because it seems like a lot of the police reformers seem to assume that, oh yeah, just get rid of these things, it'll be costless, not thinking, what are the knock-on effects if you reduce the pay of police officers by reducing their protections? What will be the consequence of that? They don't ask people who want to reform police, like, are you actually willing to pay for it? Would you? I guess I'd like to ask those really interested in reforming police in this way, like, how much would you be willing to pay for less misconduct? But nobody asked, not to my knowledge. I think another, as a side point, an interesting political economy issue is, taxpayers aren't this homogeneous group. That is, I imagine that the people responsible for the majority of the taxes, wealthier individuals, aren't the ones who tend to experience the police misconduct. They might say, yeah, lower my taxes, who cares? Whereas it tends to fall on poorer individuals who have more interactions with the police and pay a smaller portion of the taxes. So I mean, this suggests to me that maybe a city such as Chicago might be too big of a scale on which to provide policing in such a way that everyone is satisfied. Another related issue to this, so talked about this, greater protections potentially leading to more misconduct. I mean, the main argument in favor of giving police officers greater protections, it's not, oh, so we can pay them less. It's that if they don't have these protections, then they're going to engage in de-policing. So the idea with de-policing is, I mean, it goes by various names after, see the Michael Brown case a number of years ago. They called it the Ferguson effect. That is, police just withdrawing, doing the least amount they can. Like, if I just hang out in my car and only maybe respond to calls for service when I have to, then there's less of a chance that I'll get in trouble. So the argument for these protections, like qualified immunity, is that if police are doing a good faith effort in their job, but say accidentally end up hurting someone, that, hey, they won't be civilly liable for this. And this is to encourage them to be proactive, go prevent crime rather than shirking, as I would otherwise call de-policing. Why are they able to engage in shirking? Well, they are a taxpayer-funded bureaucracy. There's not competition from another service provider who will cause them to lose business by not engaging in shirking. So again, a firm in competition with other firms, they're going to pay a cost if they engage in shirking. They want to minimize liability while also adequately protecting customers, so they don't have the same flexibility, I'd say, in terms of engaging in de-policing. They are going to be replaced. So I got a few minutes. I'll engage in some self-promotion. Go find this paper in the journal Public Choice and go download it, pump up the numbers, cite it. Except, I'm like, is anybody still interested in this issue? So this was a paper about the Defund Movement. It seems like nobody talks about this. We want to think the people who are in support of it want to pretend it never happened. Or does anybody remember this phenomenon? So after, yeah, the summer of love. It seemed like a lot of city leadership wanted to make it seem like they were doing something, right? So the TLDR of this paper is that so these politicians, usually large blue cities, wanted to seem like they were doing something about police misconduct, but they're kind of constrained in how they can reform police. Like, if we want to ban chokeholds or these other procedures, this is actually hard to do because this would be considered a change in wages and working conditions, and then you have to engage in binding arbitration with the police union. So it's hard to do. Most cases where you see something like banning chokeholds or different police tactics tends to be at the state level because they don't have these contracts with municipal police departments, so they're less constrained in that way. So what they ended up doing, like, okay, we can cut their budgets. Of course, like, you do not touch the wages of current police officers, but what you can cut is future hiring. So that's where most of the cuts happened, is in terms of hiring police. But in this environment of the summer of love and its aftermath, I mean, a lot of these cities experienced like record high murders that year. And it's really hard as a politician in the face of this environment to like remain committed to like, no, we're not hiring more police. What ended up happening is pretty much all of these cities ended up not only after whatever cuts they made going back to where they were, but more than that. So it's, kind of a short flash in the pan, but that's kind of the story there, a story of police union constraints, wanting to make it seem like you're doing something and not really, well, I guess they did something. To conclude, even though we tend to think of something like policing as maybe being conducive to a bureaucratic management, that it's like, okay, somebody breaks the law, we have these rules, you go arrest them, and so on and so forth. But it's really more complicated than that in terms of what consumer preferences are. And as I mentioned, there's all kinds of trade-offs in the provision of security. And when security is provided through the bureaucratic means, due to the lack of economic calculation, the bureaucrats are in the dark, if their goal were to allocate resources to their most highly valued uses. And so reform can't solve these problems. You're just going to end up at a different place on the trade-off and still be in the dark regarding what consumers would prefer in terms of where to be along that trade-off. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to questions. One? Who's lucky?
Have you thought of free market, private solutions to many of the problems that you've outlined with government policing?
So, question is, have I outlined private solutions to these problems? So, I think, as I hinted at during the lecture, I think a lot of the problem is the public domain. So, I don't want to have like too simplistic of a story, just like, privatize the streets and everything. But I'd say that's where a lot of the crime occurs, is areas in which, where you truly have this public goods problem. People talk about policing being this public good that's going to be underprovided if markets are providing it. And so that's why you need the government to step in. I don't think a public goods problem is really inherent to any good. It's more, what are the property rights associated with this good? When you have this expansive public domain in which nobody owns it, nobody captures the benefits from improving it, then there's less of an incentive. So by having this expansive public domain, that does make security a public good in that sense. And various other things, these differences we talk about with private property, where it seems, as I mentioned, when you restrict police, like you have to wait until somebody commits a crime until you can do anything about it. Like this isn't conducive to crime prevention, right? Whereas private entities can exclude certain parties. And I think, to the extent you can expand that private property and the incentives with it, and economic calculation, I'd say that you'd see less crime. So in a way, say at a more micro level, you already can see it, right? In the United States, crime is very concentrated, right? It's a handful of counties in which half the murders happen. There's a lot of it. I think of where my grandmother lived in Berthold, North Dakota. They don't have any police there. There's no cops. Everybody knows everybody. It's I guess you could probably call the county sheriff if you need some, but generally it's like I don't know. Is that it's anarchy there, So yeah, I'd say on a small scale where you have private property, private enforcement, you already see in a way this operating to some extent. Thank you.